Good morning, dear Intriguer, and welcome to Intrigue Outloud. On today's show, I'm joined by Intrigue co-founder John Fowler to discuss Slovakia's general election and a novel new approach to the war on drugs. It's all coming up. Hey there, John. How are you?
Doing very well, Ethan. We're both dressed to the nines in golf polos. Mine is because I ran out of other clothes. You play some golf this morning, or?
No, I didn't. This shirt, I'm sure you've seen it a dozen times. I used to work at a golf club, and they gave me 6 of these exact shirts to wear throughout the week. I kept all 6, and now I wear them just about every day still.
I think that's called decision efficiency. Minimize the decisions you make in your personal life, right?
Cleared everything else out of my closet. Just 6 plain blue striped polos. It's really great. You should try it. So, John, a few weeks ago, we chatted about EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's State of the EU address, the Société, how it showed that, the war in Ukraine represented a potentially unifying moment for the continent. Today, we're going to talk about the other side of that unity.
Yeah, well, I remember when we had that chat about von der Leyen's speech, we made a passing reference to her very difficult job of keeping all member states kind of singing from the same hymn sheet. I think that's the story that we're covering today. Is elections are generally the best barometer of how the public is feeling about issues and what they have to say about government. And there was an election in Slovakia over the weekend. Tons of issues, obviously, given it was a national election, but it essentially ended up becoming a referendum on Slovakia's support for Ukraine because amongst other reasons, the positions of the main candidates were just so wildly different. It was kind of the one unifying thing that they all had a position on. Pre-election polling last week wasn't particularly conclusive, but it looks like that the Ukraine Skeptical Party of Robert Fico, I think, has won enough votes to secure a majority in the Slovak parliament. I think it's not a sure thing that he'll be able to form a coalition to govern. He's not a popular character, and his rivals are really very keen to prevent him taking power. But that's where we are now.
Yeah, he's at least been given the first go ahead at attempting to form a coalition.
Right.
But so what do we know about Robert Fico?
Well, he's an interesting character. He was prime minister from 2006 to 2010. And then again from 2012 to 2018 as leader of a very populist party called Direction Social Democracy, aka SMER, S-M-E-R.
Don't ask how those letters become that acronym.
Right, exactly. It sounds a little bit like Spectre, but I digress. But interestingly, Fico was forced to resign in 2018 over what was a huge crisis or scandal in Slovakia, but it was the murder of an investigative journalist and the journalist's fiance. And some people linked that murder back to his party. He was unable to run and nearly went to prison on organized crime charges, but he managed to avoid going to prison because his fellow lawmakers agreed to grant him immunity from prosecution. And this was, as I said, it was a huge issue in Slovakia. There were protests. I think a really important, well-connected Slovakian businessman was sentenced to jail for the murder. It was a hit. It was proven to be a hit. So it was really controversial. And actually, some analysts, I think, say that his legal battles, avoiding all this stuff, was the impetus behind him running for prime minister again. That sounds familiar, doesn't it?
John, down.
As for Fico's politics, I think it's fair to say they kind of shift with the winds. He's been pro-Western in the past, but during his most recent run for office, he was staunchly anti-EU, socially conservative. He had lots of anti-gay rhetoric and that kind of nasty stuff. And importantly, he was fiercely, fiercely anti-Ukraine. He actually said in his victory speech that, and quoting here, people in Slovakia have bigger problems than Ukraine. And he wrote in an all caps on Facebook, you know, that classic boomer way of communicating on Facebook, all caps, the world is starting to get fed up with Zelensky and Ukraine because they are ungrateful and still unsatisfied. You know, it's an interesting position to be irritated about the level of gratefulness shown by a guy fighting a war. But there we are. He's promised to end Slovakia's military aid to Ukraine as a result. So it's pretty serious stuff.
You said it was all caps, but I didn't hear you speaking in all caps.
I was gonna. I don't want to yell down the microphone.
Well, John, I mean, he doesn't sound so dissimilar to other characters that we've come to know and love. Maybe not, you know, depending on who you are.
I was going to say, where are you going with that, love?
He sounds like Hungary's Viktor Orban to me.
Yeah, okay, that's the rub. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think you're right, not least because Orban celebrated on Twitter or X or whatever with a post that read, again, quote, "Guess who's back? Always good to work together with a patriot. Looking forward to it." So there's I mean, between world leaders, that's pretty warm. That's pretty genuine. So there's obviously a connection between the two. So if we kind of zoom out a bit, I mean, it's not great news for Ukraine because Slovakia has been a really big donor of aid to Ukraine. Was among the first countries to supply Ukraine with fighter jets and tanks. And I think it'll be disappointing for Ukrainian supporters in Slovakia and in Ukraine, of course, because they're potentially losing a reliable friend. You know, I think there's still a chance. I say potentially because I think there's a chance that Fico does, if he does end up managing to form a coalition and taking power. He seems to be a bit of a pragmatist. So I think there's a chance that he will kind of realize that he's through the political campaigning side of things and take a more moderate course. You know, I think that in a way is less concerning than Viktor Orban's position, which has been much more kind of almost principled opposition to the Ukrainian aid. And, you know, I think particularly if, you know, I think people have compared him to Giorgia Meloni in Italy, which is not a dissimilar situation as well. Giorgia Meloni was elected on a fairly right-wing platform. If we remember, there was breathless headlines about how she was, you know, to the right of Mussolini and all this kind of stuff. But she's really been pretty moderate in practice when she's had to govern. I think the hope is that Fico might be the same as well.
But still, John, I mean, no matter how pragmatic Fico becomes, this election still tells us a lot about where European voters are, at least on the issue of support for Ukraine, right?
Yeah, it does. I think it's important to separate European voters. I mean, there's Eastern European, Northern European, you know, it is one block, but they are, you know, hugely disparate with different interests. But I think you can draw the generalization and say we are starting to see some cracks showing up in that sort of pro-unity, pro-Ukraine position. In Poland, which has got an election coming up in about 2 weeks on the 15th of October, the ruling party there has taken a pretty sharp turn against Ukraine or supplying Ukraine with aid in recent weeks, I think mostly as an electoral strategy. When we were at UNGA a couple of weeks back, I covered the comments from President Andrzej Duda, who said Ukraine is like a drowning person. You know, they'll take you down with them, kind of idea, which is pretty punchy language, to be honest. And then shortly after that, Poland suspended arms sales to Ukraine. So, you know, there was a bit of follow up as well. And that's despite Poland, I think, being probably Ukraine's staunchest supporter since the start of the war, arguably anyway. I think Polish politicians have expressed their frustration by, you know, banning imports of Ukrainian grain, and those they've got a lot of issues with Ukraine, and they're kind of managing to harness it and use it in an election context. Overall, though, I think it shows that countries along Ukraine's borders, and let's not forget, they've accepted millions of refugees from Ukraine. They've provided billions of dollars of aid. They're starting to feel the resources are stretched a bit thin. And when you're campaigning for political office, it's very easy to blame these things for the problems of your people when you want to get reelected, right?
Yeah, but John, it's not just Ukraine's neighbors. I mean, we here, fortunate enough to live in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., we just watched over the weekend lawmakers step back from the brink. I know, you saw it too. We watched it all with shock and consternation. Lawmakers step back from the brink of a government shutdown that was frankly only averted when Democrats on Capitol Hill agreed to go along with the demands of some Republican members to suspend aid to Ukraine. That was what ultimately averted the shutdown.
Yeah, right. And not just a little bit of money either, not chump change. Republicans I think stripped, or in the House at least, they stripped about $6 billion in assistance to Ukraine that a bipartisan group of senators had previously agreed to. So it's it's a good amount of coin there. A few days before Congress voted to keep the government open, the House held a vote on prohibiting all aid to Ukraine, and that won 93 Republican votes, up from 70 votes in July. Again, that's not overly concerning at this point, because I think those people are what you would call on the more extreme side, but the upward trend, I think people will be watching that. I don't think ultimately it means, the vote over the weekend means that Ukraine funding will be suspended for that long. Congress will probably get itself together and pass a different piece of legislation to provide Ukraine with ongoing military and economic assistance. But it shows, as I say, that trend around the world for those who have been supporting Ukraine, that their patience perhaps isn't infinite, and they're getting a little frustrated.
So what can Ukraine then do to head off this trend, both across the Atlantic, Europe and the US? Is it is its PR strategy insufficient?
Well, the simple answer is not simple to execute, and that's that they need some serious major battlefield victories in the counteroffensive that wasn't the counteroffensive over the summer. I think it's important to kind of realize the counteroffensive isn't necessarily going badly. And I think that's been the message of the 37-year-old head of Ukraine's spy agency lately. He's been making the rounds of Western media, reminding everyone that this stuff doesn't happen overnight. You're fighting a well-resourced army. They got, a whole year almost to dig in, got to be patient. And also pointing to the fact that Ukraine has broken through some Russian defenses in some places. So, I don't think it's going badly per se, but it's certainly not going well. And it's certainly not going as well as people who are funding and pouring billions of dollars of aid into Ukraine would like it to be going. Realistically, there hasn't been any movement in the front lines for, almost a year now, since last November. I think the other problem is that without those battlefield victories, the moral arguments are quite hard to sustain over time. I think, famously Winston Churchill did a great job of it in World War II for 6 years, but now it's kind of hard to sort of, convince people they need to spend money and more money and more money and more money on the moral side alone. I think that obviously this misses the bigger picture. It's quite a short-sighted position to take, but it's the dynamic that's kind of driving the Ukrainian skepticism around the world of battlefield victory, or what are we getting for our money? I think on the bright side, because we've always got to have a bright side, there are a bunch of EU foreign ministers in Kiev yesterday as a show of support for Ukraine. I think that most governments, again, we've talked about Poland, Slovakia. They were in elections. That's a specific context. My gut tells me that most governments still remain behind Ukraine. There are some cracks, but I'm not being pessimistic. I think it'll be okay, at least into the near future.
Today's episode is sponsored by Patent Drop. If you love international intrigue, you'll love Patent Drop. It's a twice-weekly tech briefing that will keep you on the front lines of innovation. Patent Drop's team of investigative journalists scour the U.S. patent and trademark website to uncover the revolutionary ideas that indicate the direction big tech companies are taking our future. Check out the show notes to learn more. All right, welcome back. So we've just now talked about the evolving Republican position on Ukraine, but we've also learned a lot about other Republican foreign policy priorities during the course of the presidential primary. And John, here's the one that stuck out to us.
So as president, would you support sending U.S. Special Forces over the border into Mexico to take out fentanyl labs, to take out drug cartel operations? Would you support that kind of American military use?
Yes, and I will do it on day one. Here's the thing. The cartels are killing tens of thousands of our fellow citizens. You want to talk about a country in decline? You have the cartels controlling a lot of part of your southern border. We have to reestablish the rule of law, and we have to defend our people. The President of the United States has got to use all available powers as Commander-in-Chief to protect our country and to protect the people.
For a tiny fraction, and it will be a tiny fraction, of what we have already spent in Ukraine, we can help you, Mexico, regain your sovereignty from the Mexican drug cartels who are spilling over into our own homeland here. But if you don't do it, then we will come in and get the job done ourselves. Because the fact of the matter is, it's like if you have a neighbor who has a dog that comes over to your yard and keeps biting your family members repeatedly. If they keep repeatedly doing that, at some point you can take a shotgun and shoot that dog. That's legitimate, legal, morally, ethically justified.
Okay, so that was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis at the first Republican debate, and then Vivek Ramaswamy on a Fox Business show. John, what's going on? Why are they threatening to invade Mexico?
It's a great question. I don't know. No. Well, actually, it's not even really their idea. It's one that dates back, I think, to the later years of the Trump administration, I think was when it first popped up as a thought bubble. I think they would say, and you sort of heard them say it in those clips, that the drug cartels based in Mexico are responsible for importing a hell of a lot of dangerous opioids like fentanyl into the US. And those opioids kill a lot of Americans. And in that regard, I think it's a very reasonable point. It's a huge issue. The opioid crisis in America is no joke. Drug-related deaths have skyrocketed in recent years from about under 20,000 at the turn of the century, and that's the 21st century, so 23 years ago, to over 107,000 in 2021, which is just wild. I don't want to get too deep into the pharmacological side of things, but a big part of this is how much more potent drugs are. Fentanyl, for example, is orders of magnitude more potent than its predecessors, like heroin or other drugs like that. And according to the Washington Post, a year's supply of pure fentanyl powder for the US market would fit in the beds of 2 pickup trucks. So yeah, and then you kind of think about how if that's what you're trying to smuggle over a border, it's pretty easy to do that if you've got that little that needs to be smuggled in over the course of a year, right? So I think the idea among some Republicans in their presidential primary debates is to get tough and finally end the drug war, or the war on drugs, as it were, by bringing the entire weight of the US armed forces to bear on the cartels in Mexico.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's play the outro music and wrap up early. I mean, who could argue with that?
Great idea, right? Problem is, a lot of people have problems with it, and I suspect even some of our listeners, when you first hear that kind of like go to war against the drug cartels in Mexico, it just doesn't pass the smell test, I don't think. First of all, because such an operation would require the consent of the Mexican government, who are unlikely to give it, to put it mildly.
It's only if you're doing things by the book, John.
Oh, God, it's a resident American going AWOL on me again. When this idea cropped up, kind of, I don't know, probably was the spring, Mexican President AMLO called the proposals arrogant and said, not only are we not going to allow it, we're denouncing it. So, pretty strong words to get a sense of what the Mexicans think about it. I mean, he won't be in power by the time the next US president is inaugurated. So, it won't be him dealing with this issue if it is actually an issue. But I can't comprehend that any Mexican president would allow US troops, to have carte blanche to run around Mexico, doing as they wish.
That's only if the Mexican people elect their president, John. Need I go on? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Conspiracy theories, you heard them here first. The people are going to trace back the fall of Mexico to the 51st state of America back to this podcast, Ethan. We're going to get in trouble. No, but more seriously, because it is a serious issue at its core, although it's tempting not to treat it seriously because it's so, clearly absurd. But I think the bigger problem is that American interventions don't really work, and it's kind of how many more examples of this do we need before we kind of get the message right? I think if the US were to go ahead with a unilateral strike, as you are clearly not suggesting, by the way,
no,
but if they struck on Mexican territory, like maybe they have struck on Afghanistan or Iraqi or Pakistani territory in the past, it's safe to assume that any cooperation with Mexico on everything from border control to trade relations would become quite a bit more difficult. It's not a good idea, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think even threatening an invasion, it might sort of give a boost to the poll ratings to Ramaswamy and these characters, but it also gives a huge boost to politicians who warn against American interventionism and rail against that kind of stuff as well. So it'd be a pretty good thing for China and Russia, I'd have to think as well.
It's called a coalition of the willing, John. Look it up. For the love of God, look it up. So, to be serious, like you said, this is a serious problem. Americans are dying of opioid overdoses. What options do policymakers have to battle the cartels?
Yeah, well, I think that's it's all of the problem. There aren't many options, and that's why we get these kinds of ideas, making it onto the headlines. If we sort of look at the problem, cartels operate essentially the same as a terrorist organization, right? Their leadership is kind of diffuse. They're all over the place. There's no clear chain. I mean, there's a clear chain of command, but it's not, you can't just go and take down the leader and the whole thing falls apart. They certainly don't abide by international rules of war and these kinds of things. And they absolutely use terror to intimidate local populations that, almost certainly don't want them operating around them. I think some Republicans pointed to the drug war in Colombia and America's involvement in that as a model to follow. And it's true, homicides in Colombia have certainly fallen, many, many reasons for that, but the production of cocaine hasn't at all. So it's gone up, which kind of tells you that, you probably shouldn't be pointing to that as a great example of what you're trying to do in Mexico if you want to fix the opioid crisis. So, I mean, long story short, I don't know what the fix is. I hope there is one, but I don't think it's going to be as satisfying as many people want. But something has to be done because hundreds of thousands of people have been killed as a result of drug trafficking. Again, let me reiterate here, I'm skeptical. I'll go on record as skeptical that military force is the answer here for these kinds of problems. It certainly makes a chest-thumping moment for these folks trying to stand out amongst the political dregs of running for president, but it's not the right idea. And I think it's, back to our first story today, it's a really good example of the kinds of things that can kind of get taken out of context and blown up out of proportion when you're involved in election seasons. The reality is I can't imagine this would ever be, a policy going forward.
Well, John, I've stormed the beaches of Cancun once before, and I'm not afraid to do it again. So,
you have margarita in hand, right?
And that's going to do it for me. By the way, it's Nobel Prize season, and the committee just handed out its first few awards over the weekend. Check out the International Intrigue newsletter to see who won and why. In the meantime, I'm Ethan Plotkin. See you on Friday.